Welcome and thank you for joining us today to walk through our research on the salary squeeze, looking at how employers can manage rising living costs. My name is Zoe Wilkins and I am running the data insights team here at Totaljobs, so really supporting customers with the wealth of data we have to build, develop and execute on our customers' talent strategies. Today, we will be talking around the impact of rising cost of living in the UK, both on the employee side, but also on the business side with the recruitment budget of businesses across the UK. This session will, of course, be recorded and we'll share the recording slides and the full report where all this information is packaged up after the webinar. We'll also be joined at around the 10 o'clock mark by a fantastic panel. So we have Professor Jonathan Portes, Professor of Economics and Public Policy at King's College London. We have Josephina Smith, Global People Director at YouGov. And last but not least, Marvin Simmons, Key Account Manager at Totaljobs. And they'll all be sharing their expertise across this topic. Before we head into that, I will be running through the key findings from the research, but please do pop any questions that you may have into the chat box as we go along, and we'll put them to that panel of experts at the end for you. Some of you watching this may already work with us at Totaljobs, but just a brief summary for those of you that don't. The core of what we do is really working with employers to attract and recruit the people you need for your business to grow. So whether you're looking to recruit around the world through Totaljobs global hiring, or you're looking to define and execute your EVP or your employer brand with Universum, we don't just post jobs. We're really a recruitment solutions partner with a range of products to drive your hiring process, whatever your priorities or challenges may be. And we back that up with the data insights team as well, bringing that wealth of data across the group to really inform and provide actionable insights to our customers also. So starting out with the state of play and where we are as a nation at the moment. So we know that inflation is rising faster than salaries. We see it across the news. We're bombarded with that information. What we can really see coming from the Bank of England as well is that when that energy price cap is lifted, we know inflation could reach as high as 7.25%. The Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, has said the inflation forecast coming from the Office for Budget Responsibility is going to be on average around 7.4% this year. Looking at estimates from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, there's a suggestion that an average worker will be around or just shy of £13,000 a year worse off by the middle of the 2020s. So really challenging time for everybody across the spectrum, but a lot of reports are really suggesting this rising cost of living is going to hit people on the lowest incomes hardest, of course. So according to the Resolution Foundation, on average, the lowest income families in the UK spend twice as much proportionally on food and housing bills out of what they earn as the richest. And we know sort of from the Chancellor's mini budget last week, there's planned sort of national insurance rises coming alongside additional measures. But we will hear more from Jonathan when we move to that panel on how far that really goes. So looking then at, that's the state of play of the market. What's the impact on our workers? So the majority of workers, so that's 77% there, are concerned about the rising cost of living. It's something that's really playing on people's mind. We know almost half report having limited disposable income, going as far to say they're living effectively payslip to payslip. And coupled with that, we see 45% of people stating that their salary has decreased, or their savings, excuse me, have decreased since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. So this really comes into a little bit of a head with where we see from the research, 9% of people reported, for example, they were no longer able to afford their rent. We saw 7% of people also reporting they'd already moved because of rent increases. So having a real impact on the day-to-day lives of people there. When we look at the work-related costs, we can see these have risen for 90% of workers. So you can see the breakdown sort of on the slide there of where that comes from, but this ranges from anything, you know, from higher energy bills due to working at home, to higher commute costs than have been felt in the past few years, as well as lifestyle costs. So, for example, by buying lunch out with colleagues or grabbing a morning coffee on the way into work. And of course, when we think about the pandemic specifically, pieces like COVID-related, COVID-related clothing, PPE, face masks coming in there as well. So when we think about higher salaries and that squeeze that people are feeling, what we see from the research is 30% are saying their salary simply does not cover their living costs, while just over a third, so that 36% mark, say their salary doesn't allow them to have a good quality of life. So they may be able to physically afford their life and their disposable income, but it's not what they would consider a good quality. And the reaction from that, from a candidate perspective, is that just over a third again, so 37% of UK workers are considering changing roles within the next year to combat that rising cost of living. So we see that 17%, almost a fifth there, have already handed in their notice this year so far to accept a higher salaried position. And just as we're seeing in terms of the cost of living impact, again, we're seeing a little bit of a divide, with essential workers twice as likely to have handed in their notice this year to move into a different sector for higher pay. So 10% of essential workers have made that change versus 5% of non-essential workers there. When we look at what's happening from a salary perspective, and which sectors are really being the most impact, where are we seeing growth, where are we seeing stagnation, you can see the top 10 sectors there for each of those. So seeing, when we look at salary growth, advertising, property, design, public sector, legal, retail, for example, we're seeing a lot of sort of office specific roles that are actually experiencing some salary growth. We know there was a little bit of a hiatus during the pandemic for a lot of organizations, and so this is relatively expected. When we see the stagnation, on the other hand, what we really mean by that is salaries have increased by less than the current rate of inflation at that 5.5%. So it's going to be interesting to see how that pans out in terms of when people make that change into a new industry, what industry is looking most attractive to them and where they're likely to move. We have a tool available to look at some of this data called the Career Change Tracker. And what this really does is it looks over 6 million data points on the UK recruitment market to say, actually, which industries are the most people joining, which industries are the most people leaving, or which industries are churning their own talent internally to that industry. So really expecting to see some of those changes coming through in the next 6 months or so in relation to this salary squeeze research. So shifting over from the candidate side to the business side and the impact there, the real headline is 80% of employers are also concerned about the rising cost of living. So there's a variety of factors there, from sort of increasing overheads to produce products or services, staff retention levels, employee quality of life, and so on, as you see on the slide there. What's interesting is how high quality of life is on that list. So we'll come on to actions businesses are already taking to support staff, as well as what employees want to be in a short while. From a salary trend perspective, what's quite what sort of stood out to me here is what we're seeing is the employee experience on the left hand. So 42% of workers said they did receive a pay rise of 1 to 5%. So remembering that is still lower than current inflation. But actually on the employer side, we saw 58% reported that they had increased salaries over the last year. So just over a third rose salaries by 5% or less, with 2/3 going a little bit further. Some same sort of percentage reported no change to those salaries, that 35% again, and we saw 7% of employers actually reported they had decreased salaries. When we look at the motivations or the candidate perceived motivations, we saw 38% said they received a raise as part of a standard company process, 13% came from a promotion, and 6% came from an internal move at their organisation to gain that higher pay. When we look at what happened once people were sort of moving away from their organisation, we saw 14% of workers were offered another job with a higher salary and received a higher counter offer from their current employer. So again, really challenging in terms of from a worker perspective, needing to make some of those changes to get that higher salary, but also that consideration on the higher cost of retaining talent there as well. And finally, almost half of workers said their pay had remained the same in the last year, with 11% getting a pay cut. And when we look at the reasons businesses sort of reported this were, workers felt, 35% of them felt pay rises weren't given because the business couldn't afford it. 19% didn't know why they weren't given a raise, and 16% said there simply wasn't an opportunity for progression, which stopped them getting that raise as well. So that was what happened in the last year. When we look forward at salary expectations for the year ahead, we can see a third of workers don't really expect their pay to increase in the next 12 months. They're more pessimistic than employers, so only 13% of employers aren't expecting to raise their salaries in actual fact. And this pessimism rises across some particular sectors. So 51% of social care workers don't expect their pay to increase, 41% when we look to the education sector, and 37% within healthcare professional communities as well. So again, seeing that pessimism on the outlook really being driven by the essential worker population as well. And for those that do expect their pay to increase, a considerable amount of them don't expect it to increase higher than inflation. However, again, the more positive side of that is that half of businesses anticipate raising salaries by more than inflation over the next year. So 25%, for example, are expecting to increase pay by between sort of 6 to 10%. 15% are expecting to increase salary by 11 to 20%, and 8% are expecting to increase by even more than that 20% across the course of the year. When we look to what's driving these pay rises, it's really interesting to see that rising living costs are cited by employers as the top or the main reason for pay rises over the next year. So 62% citing that as the top reason. Company policy was also cited. So you've got 62% of rising cost of living, 46% employee retention, 29% due to rising profits. We then have company policy being cited by 23%, the same amount. Also said government requirements to do so would push that through. And then looking a little bit further down the list on what's driving those pay rises, we can see 20% of employers said it was due to worker shortage, so trying to become more attractive to get people into their industry or into their organisation, and 5% really landed there at the lack of migrant workers due to Brexit as well. So the good news is 84% of employers are taking action to support staff with those rising costs. So the vast majority have already taken action, with cost of living really being front of mind. Thinking about, actually, what are some of the areas you can look at as individuals and as organisations to support your staff. We'll touch on that shortly, but our research has also highlighted the support employers are looking for at government level. So not necessarily at that company level, but on a national level. And again, Jonathan will touch on this during our panel discussion. So getting on to the nitty-gritty, I suppose, of what employers are doing and what candidates are looking for. So what we saw was that over half, so around 52% of UK workers said a pay rise in line with inflation would support them or help them to manage the rising cost of living that they're experiencing in their personal life. Salary, of course, is often at the top or very, very near the top of the list of needs for employees. So regardless of the wider context, this focus on salary from employees, of course, is not something that's new, but is something that's just becoming more important and more acute for workers there. When we look at what employees are already doing, we can see just over a third of employers say they're already giving pay rises in line with inflation. Nearly a quarter, so around the 23%, are offering pay rises that are actually higher than inflation at the moment. Workers are actually pointing, for example, to the desire for a one-time bonus as an alternative measure that could be introduced in today's market. So 22% of workers flagging that as a way to really support them handling their rising cost base. And actually 15% of the employers within the research had already made something of that kind available to their staff, which is great to see. Moving on to the next sort of chunk, we saw 36% of workers want to be paid overtime. So we know that generally people are working more hours now, and a third of people citing this really points to a significant volume across the UK landscape working unpaid extra hours that they would like to see themselves remunerated for. So obviously it's not as simple as seeing what level of remuneration or salary are offered by similar businesses in similar roles. That's of course helpful, that salary benchmarking piece. But what we're really seeing is actually that need for HR teams to really take the time to review the total package, the total compensation of all of their staff, and ensure that they're creating fair and equitable compensation structures within that. So when businesses are looking to analyse and evaluate, for example, their internal job structures, the idea being the output is to ensure there's a level of responsibility on the side of the employer to look at the impact each of those roles are having, and making sure, as I say, there's a fair and equitable compensation structure in place to support workers there as well. So from there, employers can really review the compensation packages of current employees to make sure they're aligned, and if they're not, adjustments can of course be recommended. And once this sort of audit has been completed, employers can be really confident that not only are they competitive against the external market, because they can see from salary and benefits and compensation benchmarking what's going on out there in the market, but it also means that remuneration on the table internally is reflective of the accountability and responsibility of those comparable roles, and that it's fair and it's equitable across the board. And remembering, I think I've mentioned a few times around that sort of total package or that total compensation, it's really stepping away from simply looking at salaries to also looking at it from a perks, a benefits, loyalty rewards, bonuses perspective, because as we've seen from the research, that's something that's really resonating with candidates and that they're hoping to see more of. Flexibility. So according to employers, 29% of them are already offering some form of flexibility. So whether we call that flexible working or hybrid working, 29% say that they're taking that approach in order to help staff manage their living costs. a fifth, well, just shy of a fifth, 19% of people really want the freedom to choose where they can work to help them with their spending. So, that takes a variety of different sort of approaches, but something that I think there's been a lot of discourse around back to office and how much people want to work from home versus coming into the office, but that cost component is really coming to the fore now with the rising cost of living, and flexibility really continues to be sought after in general, right? So nearly a third of workers now say flexible working in some format is a must-have, and they just would not apply for a job if it didn't have that. And almost half, so 47%, said they consider it as a nice to have, and it's something that would really encourage them to apply for a role. So while it may not be an absolute no if it's not available, it's something that would really help that organisation or that role to stand out to them as more attractive. And what we've seen, as we say, is a quarter of people would not apply to a job that didn't have some kind of model in this way. So it's quite interesting to see, actually how much the cost is impacting there, and how much it's a must-have versus a nice-to-have across the candidate basis. So as we can see, 41% would be swayed or encouraged to look for roles if that hybrid working was offered as well. Thinking then around actually, how can we provide financial well-being and support? We know with the rising cost of living, it's really overwhelming, or it can be overwhelming for employers and for workers alike. So to tackle this, 24% of businesses are already providing some form of financial well-being advice to their staff. So this could come in the form of seminars or webinars, or creating an online portal that's got impartial financial or debt advice for employees as well, is something that's quite popular. We're also seeing the real importance of highlighting mental health support as well. So whether that's in place in the business, whether that's promoting free external resources for staff, providing that mental health support is something that can help to combat that overwhelming feeling around that rising cost of living. And we know from the research that people with so-called problem debt are significantly more likely to experience mental health problems. So it's those that are in the toughest of financial situations who are most likely to need that mental well-being support within your businesses as well. 14% of workers have said they want to see this kind of support from their business. So it's something that is growing traction within the candidate population as another consideration on top of total compensation, on top of flexible and hybrid working that employees are looking for. Thinking then around sort of follow on from that on subsidies and financial help. So with changing work arrangements having a personal cost for a lot of people, as we've mentioned, particularly lower income families, over a quarter, so that 27% of workers would like their employer to offer something in the way of financial support with, for example, energy bills related to working from home. That fifth, so that 19% wanted the same for internet bills. So whether that's just something that they've had to get as a result of that flexible or that hybrid working, or something that they've had to invest in more than they would have liked to, that's really coming out there strongly with the energy bills. We also see subsidies for commute or for travelling at 17%, and childcare at 14% were also strongly highlighted by the workers there. And this is probably the piece where we're seeing the biggest gap between employee preferences or employee needs, in fact, and employer provision. What we see is that only 13% of employers are currently meeting this need. So we can see that 13% offering loans to help staff pay their bills, but it's certainly not matching up to the volume of candidates who are looking for this kind of support in the marketplace. So we touched on when we look at job adverts and what candidates want to see. They want to see that there's flexibility. They want to see hybrid working. They want transparency around salary and compensation, for example. What I just wanted to spend a little bit more time talking about what to actually include within that advert based on the research. So with employment, getting your brand in front of passive talent has never been more important. So we know approximately 50% of the market is currently not thinking to look for a new role at the moment, or certainly in Q4 of last year. So we know attracting that passive talent and getting in front of them is really, really vital to success here. Visibility solutions really focuses on broadening the reach of your brand message, and also increasing the relevancy of your application. So including things like social jobs to proactively reach the relevant candidates while they're browsing naturally on their favorite social feeds, be it programmatic display advertising, where we see banners targeting relevant candidates for your role as they move between candidates, or be it targeted email campaigns to really connect with specific candidates, to get their attention, to grab their attention, and to talk around all of these great things that we know businesses are doing, that we also know from the research employees or workers are starting to look outside of their own boundaries to find, if they can't find it where they're at just now. So thinking about what you write in your job ad, what is it that makes someone reflect and click that apply button? So we've already covered flexible hours and hybrid working. So onto a few other factors. We can see, for example, 49% stated a transparent salary. So a physical number rather than competitive, for example. 49% would be encouraged to apply. Private healthcare, again, at 47%. Seeing free meals or free food, free breakfast, lunch, 43% would be encouraged there. Just shy of a third say subsidised gym memberships or other subscriptions. And again, 27% at the bottom of that list, but still a substantial number, say social events are really nice to have, that would encourage them to join an organisation and to therefore apply to that job. So getting to, I suppose, the key takeaways, and please do remember, you can add any questions into the chat that we can pose to our expert panel as well. So if anything has kind of come up where you'd like a little bit more information, or the perspective of one of those folks, please pop it into the chat. But what we really see as the key takeaway is that living costs are going to continue to rise in the months ahead, which could drive more people to search for work in industries that can offer higher salaries. So making changes they might not have made before. For employers, this means really striking the balance between attraction and recruitment strategies. So investing in existing staff, not only through sort of yearly salary reviews, but through training, through that fair and equitable compensation package we mentioned, that go beyond the traditional take-home pay approach. So thinking about it from a candidate attraction, but also a candidate retention or employee retention perspective. Employers are prioritising the welfare and the quality of life of their staff, which really shows how many leaders are already stepping up to the plate to create that transparent, supportive working culture. Businesses and workers are going to be keeping a keen eye on actions at a policy level to see what support from the government could really look like in the face of high inflation. And in the meantime, it's really around, as we've said, open dialogue, equitable salaries, flexibility, and understanding of what people, what pressures people are feeling. It's not only going to help staff to navigate a tough financial period, but it will also boost staff loyalty if done well, and ensure that the jobs offered on the table work for the people who will face the most disadvantage when we look at that high living cost. So on to our panel. I'd like to invite the panel to come off mute and to pop your videos on and introduce yourselves. A second there. You've popped up first. So Jonathan, I'll pick on you if you'd like to introduce yourself.
I'm Jonathan Portis. I'm Professor of Economics and Public Policy at King's College London.
Josephina?
Hi, I'm Josephina Smith, and I lead the HR team at YouGov.
Brilliant. Last but not least, Marvin.
Hi, I'm Marvin Simmons. I work for Totaljobs within the public sector division.
Brilliant, thank you. So starting out, I guess, with a few questions that come to mind. So I'll start with you, if that's all right, Marvin. So can you tell us, from your perspective, working with public sector employers, how is the rising cost of living playing out for employers at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I have seen quite lately, so I work, I said, within the public sector area, and what falls under that, typically councils and care industry, which comes to mind firstly. What I have seen quite lately, and you touched upon it earlier, Zoe, where employees are looking for kind of one-off bonuses. Employers have now kind of incorporated that within their job listings quite recently to attract new candidates with sign-on bonuses. And the reason I think that they've done that is there are limitations within what they can offer as an hourly rate. So because of that, they've had to be more creative about how they can attract new candidates into the business. Obviously, while still maintaining, within that hourly rate that they can offer to make sure that the pay is fair across the organisations. Another thing which I have seen, and typically care is one of those sectors which does have high turnover. And a lot of staff are looking to move out of that industry. As you mentioned earlier, it's kind of double most other industries. So what they're having to do to maintain and retain staff is look at how else can they go about building up a package for new candidates without going over what their hourly rate can be. But I said it does come down to being creative when it comes to advertising.
Yeah, that was certainly what I was about to say. Actually, it's around how can you be creative and say, okay, the salary is one piece. What's everything that we can wrap around that to try to make the most effective and attractive proposition. So we've kind of touched on it a little bit there, actually. But Josephina, we know there's factors outside of a business's control at play here. So you're trying to sort of balance the macro and the micro when it comes to making a decision about compensation packages. How do you really go about doing that?
Well, the macro and the micro has always been, something that we've balanced and we've had to balance in the past anyway. Being my background being in reward, we've always had to look at what's happening in the wider society as well as what's happening in the business itself. As 2022 progresses, what is really evident is that, in terms of the labour market, it's really, really uncertain. And, if I look at the global space that I work in, vacancies continue to be tight. We've got, record vacancies at play. Hiring in the US, in the UK, and I think much of Europe is still rising at the fastest pace on record. So, in terms of us, getting to that talent space and seeing that actually it's we are as a business in some ways really struggling to find and to keep those talented workers that we need to fulfill the work that we have going on. So for us, in the face of those recruitment challenges, it's become evident that staff retention is now equally as important as recruitment. Now, going back to the compensation package, we always look at the wider piece. And for us, some of the things that we're looking to support our employees with is, well, what's happening in the healthcare space? where we haven't covered people on healthcare policies, what can we do there? What can we do for our employees from a financial well-being point of view? We have just partnered with a company called Cushion, who have financial education, who also offer savings products. How can we recognize our employees by actually inputting into those saving pots for them as a recognition process? Also, in terms of, I think Marvin just mentioned from the attraction perspective, sign-on bonus, that's something that's actually rising from a business point of view, that we're also offering from an attraction point of view. And it's also interesting around the, people who perhaps come from a low socioeconomic background. The message that we give to attract those people is actually we're looking for people to thrive in our business. We're not looking for people to sort of fit in. So it's all about thriving and having those skills to thrive within our business. Apart from that, we're also looking at our critical roles and our critical people. What do we pay them? What are the pinch points? We are monitoring inflation as it's rising and thinking about what we can do when we hit that salary review piece around actually, giving people at least the inflationary rise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really fascinating to hear about it from your perspective. There's so much that goes into that kind of reward space, and there's so many different factors for organizations to juggle and to balance and to try and make the right call on. Jonathan, a question for you. The vast majority of employers really want to see more or further support from the government in balancing all of these different pieces around the rising cost of living. Could you talk us through a little bit what was announced in the budget that really aligns with this?
Well, the centerpiece of the budget was the rise in the national insurance threshold, which of course is coming into force at exactly the same time as the previously announced increase in national insurance, ostensibly to pay for health and social care. So you've got this sort of complicated thing of set of things going on, where the threshold is being increased, which is a roughly £300 tax cut for almost all employees, because the amount of pay on which you don't have to pay any national insurance goes up by about 3,000. At the same time as both employers and employees' national insurance contributions are going up. So basically all employers will pay more. And this is an important thing to remember, is that, we talk about this 1.25% national insurance contribution rise. It's not 1.25%. 1.25% of the salary for employees, and another 1.25% for employers. So from the employer's point of view, you would have to pay 2.5% more to give the employee the same take-home pay, and that's going to hit quite a lot of employers quite hard, I think, from April. But the bottom line is that this will, for some low-paid workers, this will definitely make a difference to softening the impacts. But overall, most people are still going to see themselves being significantly poorer over the year to come. And I think that the point I would make is that, the rise in the cost of living is, as you said, Zoe, primarily being driven by energy price rises. And that is because it's at a global market. We are just overall going to be poorer on average, and there wasn't much the Chancellor could do about that, the fact that overall we're going to be a bit poorer. What he did have a bunch of choices to do was how to redistribute that pain. And what he's chosen to do is actually, unfortunately, not very much. As you say, Zoe, despite this measure, people at lower and lower middle income levels are still going to be the ones who are hardest hit, because they pay a much greater fraction of their salaries in energy price rises. And moreover, people on lower incomes, in and out of work, are also obviously the ones who depend on universal credit. Remember that half of people on universal credit actually have a job. Lots of low-paid workers are on universal credit. And with universal credit only going up by 3%, that translates to a 4 or 5% cut in real terms. So some people are going to feel this squeeze really hard, and to the extent possible, I think it is incumbent on employers, as far as they can, to look at what they can do, particularly for the low and middle income workers who are struggling. To be absolutely honest, people like me, of course, I don't like having to pay higher bills. I don't like seeing my salary being eroded by inflation as it is, but it's not the end of the world. Whereas people at lower and middle incomes are really going to see this hit. And frankly, the Chancellor has chosen at this point not to do that much to help them.
Yeah, it's as you say, it's that real squeeze sitting in those lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and there's a huge amount of pressure, right? Because actually you see all these headlines around am I picking food or am I picking energy, for example, for those costs. There's a real sort of well-being aspect to all of this. So we know whenever there's any that kind of financial squeeze, there's that well-being, that mental health aspect as well. Josephina, what areas of well-being from your perspective do you think we need to focus on in today's economy? And as organizations, as managers, how can we help to spot the signs?
Well, you need to be in touch with your employees. I mean, we do that through engagement surveys, which has been around for a very long time. So during COVID, we had pulse surveys as well that we ran in between the engagement survey. So those are very helpful in getting to sort of understand the touch points. But there's nothing as good as your line managers being equipped to talk to their people on a day-to-day basis around their well-being. I mean, people have felt a lot of pressure. You would have known, or you would have seen headlines that talk about burnout post-COVID, and that is very real because a lot of the people have been having that merge between their personal lives and their work lives. I know I certainly have. So just sitting there from my perspective, not to mention, all our other employees. So, being in touch with their well-being, having those regular chats as part of their check-ins and their performance chats as well, and their development chats, it's to sort of weave it in and not see it as a separate thing. But apart from that, from a strategic point of view, we always look at well-being from a holistic point of view. We look at it from the financial piece, the physical piece, the mental piece, and the social piece. So that's what we look at. We are a social organization. We go out and we do opinion polling. Social mission is part of our purpose. So that's also very important to us from our panel point of view. So it's not just from an employee point of view either. So, from a well-being perspective, clearly it's more around the employees, but we touch on all of those 4 pillars. And bring it all together and try to have chats with our employees. We've got, really active mental health first aiders, who can spot the signs and who can help employees. So it's all about providing the right channels and the right touch points for employees to raise those issues.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. Really interesting to hear, and really positive to hear all the great work you're doing at YouGov. It's as we've said multiple times across the course of this, it's really how do you balance and how do you prioritize all of these different elements to come to the right solution, which is healthy, happy employees who want to stay. Jonathan, I think when we think about the kind of months ahead and what's coming next, from a cost of living perspective, you touched upon the energy prices and some of those challenges there. But what do you really anticipate coming in the months ahead when it comes to cost of living in the UK, and what role do you think employers can play to support their staff?
Obviously, the main thing that is happening is this whole bunch of changes that is coming, going to come in the next few weeks, which is higher energy bills, overall higher taxes, although that will depend on, that will vary between people, a rise in the minimum wage, but also price rises spreading through other parts of the economy as well. We are seeing a generalized rise in prices. So we are going to see a lot more, we are going to see what people, for a lot of people, this has been perhaps a somewhat theoretical discussion. It's going to become a much more real concern for individuals and households over the next few months. And the big unknown, I think, remains, well, is this a temporary shock? A one-time rise in prices, which, it's a hit, but after that, things go back to something more like normal. Or is it sustained? And we just don't know yet. That depends on a bunch of things, both how strongly the domestic economy recovers, and other things such as obviously events in Ukraine, and whether energy prices do hopefully begin to fall back a bit. What can employers do? Well, both Josephina and Marvin have mentioned some things already, but beyond simply pay rises, and particularly trying to help those at the lower and middle income levels. I think, to add just to what Josephine said, we do have an awful lot of research that says that one thing that people really value in their work is a sense of control and agency, a sense that they have, that they're not just cogs in the machine, but they have some control over what they do, when they do it, and how they do it. So to the extent that we can take advantage of some of the changes in ways of working that we've all been forced into over the 2 years, to try and give employees a bit more of that sense that they're in control of their own destiny. That is something that we do know. We have a lot of research does actually improve people's well-being and satisfaction at work.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting, and it of course makes complete sense, right? People want to feel that they're affecting change isn't affecting them, and so actually that consideration of how employers can create that sense with their employees is a really interesting consideration there. Marvin, a question for you actually off the back of that. Thinking about, you've mentioned kind of a lot of social care companies, for example, for employers who cannot offer flexible or hybrid working because of the nature of what they do. You can't be a GP, or I suppose you theoretically could, but you can't be a surgeon from home. How do they compete in today's market?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways you can do it. I'll go back to the care industry because it's one of the industries which I think has been the most hard hit, especially in regards to staff turnover as well. Meaningful work and job satisfaction plays a big part as to why employees join a company or an organization. So that once they're there, I think you can do a lot as an organization. You can do a lot to retain staff, and where you can't allow people to work from home if they're a carer, you could do things. For example, and you mentioned it earlier again, Zoe, subsidizing fuel costs or commute costs, especially when the rise in fuel price are then put onto the care staff. They're having to pay this out of their own pocket, and they're having to commute from one someone's house, between houses, basically. That cost is almost eaten into their pockets. There are inexpensive ways which I think companies can look at incorporating benefits. Again, you mentioned earlier, free lunches, flexible days, again, subsidizing fuel costs. All these little things can help alleviate that cost associated with just turning up to work. And there was always a monetary value to all these things, but if it outweighs and kind of can alleviate some of that stress from candidates having to pay for food when they're at work, or having to pay to get into work when some industries don't have that luxury of not having to do that, these are all things that can make that slight bit of difference. Yeah, and again, when it's affecting the rise in work-related costs is 90%, and that's a huge number to keep in mind. It's that number's going to keep growing unless we can do something to help.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think, as you say, there's a lot more focus now from a candidate or from a worker perspective on, would I be spending this money if I didn't have this job? You know, would I be putting petrol in the car to go and make these different trips to see care patients, or, you know, would I be buying lunch out, or would I have the internet package that I have to have for my role? That's, I think, as you say, one of those key differentiators of you know, of people switching industries as well, right? To switch to an industry where they don't have that cost as well. Keen to hear any questions that have come through on the chat. Ellie?
Yep, so we've got one question that's come through from another Zoe, in fact. I think this question is going to be geared to Jonathan. So 2 questions, in fact. Salary increases in line with inflation. Does this lead to hyperinflation? And also, should we be looking at inflation retrospectively or forward-looking?
So I think the first question on hyperinflation. I mean, hyperinflation, as economists use it, really mean something where inflation has become self-sustaining to the point where it is accelerating, and that typically is driven by governments simply printing money to finance deficits, not in the way which our government actually is, in some sense, printing money, but at an increasing rate. That is not what is happening here. You know, the inflation we are seeing is primarily what we would call cost push inflation. It's coming from a global rise in the cost of energy, plus supply chain bottlenecks and other disturbances to supply chains that are happening as a result of reopening. That is not going to lead to hyperinflation. I mean, you know, forecasts are always dangerous and, you know, subject obviously to geopolitical events, which I obviously am not going to forecast. But subject to that, I would certainly be willing to bet on inflation in a year, say, being significantly lower, not higher than it is now. So that's not hyperinflation. And as to whether we should look to inflation prospectively or historically, I think particularly in the current environment where we know that a degree of inflation is sort of baked in, particularly by the energy price rise, we have to look at it going forward. I mean, I don't think it's you know, so the Chancellor is, as I said, saying to benefit claimants and people and to pensioners, oh, inflation up to the middle of last year was only 3%. So that's how much I'm going to increase pensions and universal credit. I do not think that is that's not an appropriate attitude for government. It's not an appropriate attitude for employers. We have to recognise that this inflation is happening now, and that that to the extent, obviously, for every employer it's different. But within the constraints that employers have to operate, that is what employees are actually facing at the moment.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for sharing that. Ellie, was there any other questions from the chat?
Yeah, so there's one more that's come through as well, another one for you, Jonathan. Can you just talk through in a little more detail what kind of support employers are expecting from the government?
Well, overall, as I said, so for employees, not for employers, the main support was this increase in the national insurance threshold. That's where most of the money has come from. For employers in the public sector, as Marvin will know, you know, things are really quite bad, because what the Chancellor has done is stick with the spending totals for public sector organisations that were set at a time when inflation was expected to be much lower than it is now. So last year, in about October, the government made a huge deal about big increases in spending for the NHS and a bit more spending for some other services. And that, you know, there was some truth to that at the time. That's no longer the case, unfortunately. You know, one way I put it was to say that effectively what the Chancellor announced this week was a cut of £4 billion in the education budget and a cut of £6 billion in the health and social care budget, because that is what the extra inflation will mean for public sector employees. There is a bit more help for businesses via some further essentially business rate rebates, which means that especially smaller businesses will get some more essentially a sort of another temporary bit of business rate rebates, and there's a VAT cut for heat pumps and solar panels. That's expected to save businesses a bit of money, £30 million or so. And then the fuel duty cut of 5p, which will help both individuals driving and also businesses that spend a lot on fuel. So for businesses that spend a lot on fuel, that will make some meaningful difference. But overall, this is pretty small beer. The real big question on business taxation is what happens to corporate tax. So the corporate tax rate is scheduled to go up from 19% this year to 24% next year, which is a really huge tax increase for businesses. And the Chancellor didn't announce anything on that, but almost certainly I think the politics of it mean that he will have to next year. So that corporate tax cut, I would guess, will be modified and alleviated. Sorry, corporate tax increase will be alleviated in some way. But it's too early to tell. The other big thing on corporate tax is that there is still this temporary, what's called the super deduction for investment, which means that you can basically write off all of your investment and then some against profits up until April 2023. And this is really designed to incentivize businesses to invest as much as possible for the next year. So there's certainly a good argument for businesses that are thinking about investing that now is the time to do it while you get this effectively big tax benefit from doing so.
That's really, really interesting and insightful. Thank you for sharing that, Jonathan. So I think we've got to the end of our time here today. So thank you to everybody who tuned in. Of course, a special thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Josephina. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Marvin.
Thank you very much.
Keep an eye out for the email from GoToWebinar tomorrow, so you'll have a link through to all of the slides, a recording of this session, and also the full research report there as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.